This is a study that we're now finishing and starting to write up, that myself and Lisa Merrill and Henry May at Penn have done, funded by NSF. And the issue was, well, is the accountability and testing regime driving teachers out? This is something we hear again and again and again, sort of ad nauseum. Lisa had seen some blog or something in the Washington Post last spring about some very accomplished career teacher who wrote a very eloquent piece that she was throwing in the towel, and that the testing regime, that she was constrained and scripted. And so the argument is that not simply is the testing and accountability regime pushing people out, but it's pushing out really good people that we don't want to have pushed out. So, well, we decided to see if this is true. Use national data. Is standards and assessment and sanctions and sticks and carrots, what effect do those have on the retention and turnover of teachers? Big picture, national data. Is this true, or when is it true and when is it not? These anecdotal claims. And our data, just quickly, there's a national data, big picture. This is a schools and staffing survey, which we've used a great deal. And we have it over a period of time, and we're focusing on public schools here. The theory, is, we all perhaps know this, and it's pretty straightforward. We define and set the goals, the standards, then we assess, particularly with student achievement. The second step there, to what extent the school has or hasn't met those standards, and then we've got some sticks and carrots, rewards and sanctions, and then that improves things. So this is the theory here of accountability, and a simplified version of it. And our study here adds one piece, and we're very indebted to a piece by Mike Smith. By the way, Susan, you'll be happy to see that this is in a CPRE policy brief in 1991. And it's not a 3-pager, as Tom here, he mentioned, that it's 9 pages. Pretty small print. And it summarizes this seminal piece that Mike and Jennifer O'Day did on accountability and standards-based reform and systemic reform. And we're pulling from that the idea that this thing depends on this other piece. What effect having testing and accountability and sticks and carrots, what effect that has on retention really depends on how the place is managed and organized and the conditions for teachers. And there's this beautiful, I'm going to steal this, I thought a terrific analogy that Mike has to a ship voyage, which is just, I don't know whether it's an analogy or a metaphor, and I forget the difference, but whatever. One way to picture this relationship, and this is Mike and Jennifer's words, is through the analogy of a ship's voyage. The state, through the curriculum frameworks and in consultation with teachers and district personnel, provides a description of the ultimate destination. It doesn't spell out how to get from A to B. Those are my words. Teachers and other school people then have the primary responsibility and authority to chart the course, assemble the necessary provisions and crew, and pilot the ship. So I think the point here is that this is really the professional model. The idea is that we give the professionals the training, the autonomy, the resources, the time, the whatever, and then we hold them accountable. That you need both. You need both. That's sort of the professional model, and that's really, I think, the model that was originally formulated behind the whole accountability movement. And that, it's really management 101, that you don't hold employees accountable for things they have no control over, and then vice versa. You don't give employees control and autonomy of issues and then not hold them accountable. You need some balance. And so that's our theoretical perspective coming at this. Is there a link in here which, and this is in statistical terms, is there an interaction? Does the effect of this on this really depend on this? Does it vary? The conditions in schools, whether you're driving out teachers or not. That's sort of what we want to look at here. Now, we had a nice sequence. It's not causal. It just so happened that, and this is in these national data, in the 03-04 school year, the principals are asked, well, is your school subject to performance standards? Were you assessed? Was the school assessed on that? So that's for the year before they're asked. And then in the current year, well, how did you do? How did the school do? Did it pass or fail? To what extent did it pass or fail? And did your school get rewards or sanctions, sticks or carrots? And then a year later, we see a teacher retention. So it was just fortuitous. We had this nice sequence in the data to follow this nationally. What's going on? Well, what did we find? First of all, we found, and it's interesting, this is only a year into NCLB, but already everybody, and because of course a lot of states had been doing testing and accountability, all the schools are having performance standards set by the district or state, and almost all of them are having their performance assessed. So at this point, it's very widespread early on. All right, 47% of all of them, which is just over half, they passed all the standards in this year. And of them, there was a series of carrots, different ones. Less than half got some kind of carrot for passing. And there's different types of carrots. Resources or money to the school, resources or money to teachers, non-monetary recognition. So over half passed, less than half of them got some kind of carrots, and the carrots varied. On the other hand, just under half of all, 40% of all of them failed some or all the standards, these performance standards. So it's interesting to us, 1 year into NCLB, we already start to see lots of variation going on. And of them, just over half got some kind of sticks, some kind of sanctions to the school. They came in different types. One is write an improvement plan. This is sort of the vaguest of them. You write some plan how you're going to improve. The next one has far more specificity. We want to have targets and we want to have dates by which performance is going to improve. So this one has more bite in it, perhaps. And then we have the more punitive ones, and very, very few schools get these, which is you have reduction in resources. You're not doing very well, we're going to cut some of your money. I don't know about the psychology of that. But also takeover and reconstitution of some sort. So very, very small numbers of schools got this early on. Sort of the more punitive. But far larger numbers got some kind of sticks of some sort. So then a question arises, well, does this filter down to teachers yet at this early stage in the game? And so we have a bunch of self-report data from teachers. And they're quite interesting. Again, this is 2 years into NCLB, or a year and a half or something. Okay, so not all subjects, of course, are tested. We know this isn't just one of the criticisms. But over half of the teachers did report, my students did get tested in the subject I taught. Remember, this is the whole shebang from kindergarten to 12th grade. So there's a big chunk of them. It's not just the math and English teachers. Do they get access to the scores? Not all, but a heck of a lot. Do they use the standards to guide their teaching? 8 out of 10 say yes, they do. Do they use these test scores to adjust their curriculum? Do they use it as a feedback loop? Just over half say, yes, we do that. Do you use the test scores of your students to assess your own weaknesses? Just over half say yes, they do. Now this is self-report, so it's subjective. Are you worried about your job security due to your students' scores? This is sort of maybe some subjective measure of the bite effect. Do I have some threat, some fear? Which of course is sometimes implicit and sometimes quite explicit in the whole accountability movement. We're going to weed out the weak teachers sort of thing. And almost a third say, yeah, I have some fear. I have some worry about this. This one is, the teachers aren't asked, does the testing and accountability affect your caliber of teaching in your own opinion? It's actually, does it affect your kind of satisfaction with the job? And less than half say it's a positive effect. So this is the teachers' reports, and sort of how happy am I, how satisfied or dissatisfied with the accountability regime, and it's mixed. It's mixed. 55% don't like it, and 45% say that they think it's positive. Okay, so it's mixed. In fact, my own pet theory is we probably don't have enough good turnover. That is, teachers that really shouldn't be there, and Heather was talking about this some, who we want to turn over, and we probably have too much bad turnover, that is really good people leaving. All right, so there's no assumption there, and of course, we wouldn't want, nor would we ever get 100% retention. Now, we do have one proxy measure of teachers' caliber, in the sense that we have the selectivity of their undergraduate college, using Barron's ranking. So, we have that, and we control for that. But a weakness of our study is we do not have some independent measure of the caliber of the teacher's teaching. So we can't speak to the issue of, well, we drive not the good or bad. So that's a weakness to our study. We do think, however, that our dependent variable is valid, and I'll just digress a little to give some of our other research. So this is a study where we look at the turnover in the teaching, attrition in the teaching occupation compared to a whole series of others. And this is a project I did with another doctoral student, David Perda. And this is a very interesting data set. Baccalaureate and beyond, like the schools and staffing surveys from NCES, took the college class of 93, followed them longitudinally for 10 years. And so we were able to look at all these people that went into different occupations, and then which ones are still in that occupation 10 years later. And we pick up those who went to graduate school, so we're able to get lawyers, for instance. And it's quite interesting. Here's teachers. There are lines of work that have higher attrition, higher quit rates than teaching. Secretaries, child care workers, paralegals, and prison guards, all right? I was very surprised that teaching, this isn't quite statistically significant, but it's on a level with police. I have the stereotype that police work is often high-stress work, and I'm assuming that there's a certain amount of attrition in it, but teachers is really on a par. I was also surprised that teachers is higher in this data set than nurses. I don't understand pharmacy at all. I know nothing about it, but apparently this is a very stable line of work, and people do not quit from pharmacy.
Access to medication.
That's a great hypothesis. Great hypothesis. So, there's some that are higher in teaching, but certainly compared to the traditional professions, teaching's a relatively high turnover line of work. But these overall cross-occupational turnover rates mask big variations, and Henry May and I did a thing where we looked at the distribution of teacher turnover across different types of schools, aggregated to the school level. And it's highly concentrated. Its turnover of teachers is not equally distributed across types of schools. And of course this makes sense. Some types of schools have far, far higher turnover than others. There's a very wide variation. And of course poverty and urbanicity and whatnot are highly correlated in this. And we figured out that almost half of all the turnover occurs in just a quarter of the schools. And so, yes, teaching is a relatively high turnover occupation, particularly in comparison to traditional high-status professions. But that's not really the issue, because there's these huge school-to-school differences when you disaggregate. And it certainly is a big problem. In fact, this quarter, I think their average rate is almost a third of their teaching staff goes each and every year. A revolving door. Just think of the negative consequences of having to hire a whole new third of your teaching staff every year. Just the time and disruption. And in fact, very nicely, the last few years we've had a growing literature on some of the negatives. There are some positives of turnover. So I was saying, it's not all bad, but we have a growing literature. I won't go through all this, sort of mapping out some of the causes and some of the costs and consequences of high levels of teacher turnover. And Alan and Tony have done some nice work here, trying to economics and sort of the financial costs. And Lisa, her dissertation looked at New York City data and aggregated to the school level. And of course, there's a huge variation in the teacher turnover rates across schools within the New York City School District, and look at the effects on school level, aggregate level achievement. And there's some negative effects there. Lisa can maybe talk others. So, we're starting to have a growing literature that while there's some positives, the high turnover is not cost-free. So, I'm sort of doing this digression just to say a few things about a dependent variable. Because of course when we look at accountability, most of our research wants to look at its effects on the bottom line, student achievement. Fine. Fine. Here we're looking at its effect on teachers, and in particular teacher retention. So what did we find? Well, we found that some parts of a testing and accountability affect retention and some parts don't. It was really interesting to me. So that your school has standards, that the district or state has put standards on the school, does not drive people out. To statistically, doesn't mean it doesn't in some schools. That the school has assessments, how well is the school done vis-a-vis the standards, then there's pressure there. That does not drive teachers out. I mean, these are not statistically significant differences. Which is interesting. I almost want to say that accountability and assessment of schools per se aren't bad in the sense that they draw people out. Although, obviously, this is a very controversial topic, and some people get angry at me, well, there's all these negative effects. But it's not driving people out. How the school performs, however, does have a big effect, as you might imagine, on retention. If you pass the standards, and this is the bottom half here, you have better retention. If school fails, and these are averages, fails part or all the standards, you have higher turnover, lower retention. If your school passed and got some carrots, it doesn't make hardly any difference to your retention. Carrots might be great things for the high-performing school, but they're not buying your retention nationally, which is sort of an interesting finding. I mean, this is hard. This is not even statistically significant. On the other hand, if you're low-performing and that half of them, as I recall, or something like that, who get some kind of sticks, yes, it drives up your turnover. Carrots don't buy retention, sticks do drive more people out. Which is interesting. Lower performing drives more people out, sticks drive more people out. Now, recall earlier I mentioned a couple types of sticks. So there's having an improvement plan, which, its specificity or vagueness is a variable. But then there's having a targeted time table where you need to make gains. Okay, there's that stick. And then there's cutting one's resources. And then there's reconstitution takeover. So 4 sticks we looked at. And as you might imagine, these sticks don't necessarily operate in isolation. They come in packages, depending on the district or state. There's often a progression towards the more punitive. And so we did some clustering analysis or something to figure out what the packages are. So low-performing schools, 40% got no sanctions. They just had the embarrassment of low performance. And then, a fifth of all of them, of the low-performing, just got this improvement plan. But having a plan with specific targeted dates for performances, that's about the same number. And then much smaller numbers, I mentioned this before, of the low-performing schools get the heavy punitive stuff, which is we're cutting your money or resources, or teacher lines or something like that, or reconstitution. So what difference do these different packages make on turnover and retention? That's our next question. And boy, they do. So, same packages. As you get more punitive, you get much higher driving teachers out. Although, recall, there's so small numbers getting these packages that these, they look much bigger, but statistically they're very borderline of significance. The stick with the biggest individual effect on turnover was this timetable. Having that specified timetable. That one had the strongest coefficient in terms of predicting teachers moving and leaving out in the subsequent year. Schools that got that timetable. That really drove people out. It's pressure. We don't just want to plan from you. No, we want to know what gains you're going to make by when. And we want it in writing. And that has a strong effect driving people out. So let's go back to Mike's argument here of how things are managed, the capacity of the school, Are these teachers given any kind of say or sufficient resources? Back to our theory here, does that make any difference in these strong effects? We looked at 4 types of working conditions or school capacities, whatever you might call them. We looked at the leadership of the school, that is, teachers' aggregate reports on the caliber of leadership, the principal in the building. We looked at the availability of classroom resources. We looked at how much say the faculty as a whole has in school decisions. That's sort of the decision-making influence. And we looked at classroom discretion and autonomy. Turns out that's the key one. How much leeway do I have in my classroom over content, methods, homework, grading, discipline? This is the one that shrunk over time. So the national data supports part of this anecdotal thing that we're more constrained. Yes, classroom autonomy, a number of the things has shrunk, particularly since the early 90s when accountability came in. And it turns out that's the big one. That's the real big one. That has a big effect in terms of it's an interaction. That is the relationship between low-performing schools and their sanctions impacting turnover. It depends. It depends on the working conditions in the school. This bears out Mike's hypothesis, which I'm sort of maybe borrowing and bending, but but this one condition rises above all the others: classroom discretion and autonomy. Incidentally, this is the largest complaint of math teachers now. So Henry May and I have done all these analyses. What's driving out math teachers? Salaries, student discipline, lack of professional development. The biggest thing, far more than science teachers, which is a lesser tested subject, lack of classroom discretion and autonomy. This is by far the strongest correlate of math teacher turnover. And it turns out it's the one that has a big effect here. Low-performing school with sanctions have higher drive-out teachers. But if they supply higher than average levels of discretion and autonomy for the teachers, their turnover levels drop dramatically. It's a strong interaction. So that these low-performing places are losing teachers, it's not inevitable. It's not always the case. And we have this capstone slide trying to just summarize this finding. All right, so this is the annual turnover rates of the well-performing schools. And this is the average ones of the failing schools, and that's a significant difference. The failing schools that get this improvement timetable, the one with specific dates, it's driven up a significant amount. But those same places, if the teachers report they have a lot of classroom discretion and autonomy, it's way back down the level of the high performers, which, just seems like such an optimistic finding to me. Those working conditions I mentioned, resources, leadership, faculty decision-making, autonomy, are all higher in the higher performing schools and lower in the lower performing schools. Those conditions are not equally distributed, but there's variation. And in that small number, and I forget the numbers offhand, in that small number of these low-performing punished schools, there are some where the teachers are given a bunch of leeway. And boy, does it drive down their turnover. Some of them we wish they had turned over, but these are places that lose a lot of teachers. And so in the aggregate, in other words, even if it's a bad teacher quitting, it's still not cost-free in a sense. I'm not trying to defend that. Because remember the earlier slide that almost half of all the turnover is in a quarter of the schools. If you're losing 25% or more of your teachers, okay, let's suppose some of them are good losses, they shouldn't be there. That is really, we're having a growing body of research, that's just really detrimental to making that place function and any kind of coherent curriculum, etc. This is interesting. So reconstitution is in a sense an episodic planned turnover in a sense.
Yes. Yeah, right.
All right. So these places are reconstituted, but nevertheless, a year later, 30% of the teachers left over quit, which is kind of interesting. So in other words, you've reconstituted, and let's suppose you've changed a big chunk of your staff. A year later, You're hemorrhaging all kinds of more. That's
It could be the new ones who came in who quit too. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It could be the new ones. But reconstituting seems to constitute, not stop, flows out.
Right.
It's almost like it speeds up the revolving door, but we can only follow it 1 year out.
Right.
The conclusion I'm drawing is that having standards and assessment per se does not drive people out. Performance, high or low, is connected to retention or turnover. Carrots don't make any difference. Sticks do make a difference. They drive more people out. But the data suggests that that heavy driving out can be ameliorated if we supply, Mike's hypothesis, supply them sort of the tools to get the job done. In this case, leeway in the classroom. So that's our takeaway from this. So that it's sort of a yes-no answer. A typical model is to more scripting, more standardization, and is against this ship-voyage analogy where you let the people figure out how to get from A to B. But there's obviously some examples out there. We have some in that, whichever slide that was, where the teachers are given a bunch of leeway to figure it out. Some may be enlightened principle. This is building level data. So, and it's a strong statistical relationship. How common that is? Not very. I'd have to dig. Someone asked about that. That's a small percentage of those low performing where they actually have levels of autonomy as good as the teachers in the high performing. That's a small piece. It's an important piece, so it allows us to look at these variations and test this hypothesis.
Go back to the slide where it's, schools have standards, they're in this slide. What are the schools without standards in 2004? And what schools are they?
We did try to figure out who these strange schools were that said that this is in, okay, so this is in, but the principals asked the 02-03 year, did the state or district set standards? And there's a small percentage that's, wait a second, that there's 6.5% said that our district or state hadn't yet set standards.
Richard, you've succeeded in being so provocative that we're running
Yes.
overtime. So
My apologies.
no, it's fantastic. So thank you so much. And